I want to speak about the further aspect of the book, which I had the privilege to author, or to at least and certainly to translate and compile, which is called The Rediscovery of the Human, Psychological Writings of Viktor E. Frankl on the Human in the Image of the Divine. And today, I want to address give certain elucidation of the first chapter of the introduction to that book. It's a long introduction and it contains 5 chapters. Hopefully these thoughts will assist the reader. Now, the work of Viktor Frankl, which is known as logotherapy, is not meant to supplant all other psychotherapies. It is understood as an essential supplement to other existing therapies, and its role is, however, constantly to hold in central focus the fact that the human being possesses a soul, a conscience, a higher meaning faculty, and that this is something which should always be preserved in vision, even when one is focusing therapy on different aspects of the human psyche. Now, and in order to explain Frankl's concern with the spiritual or the soul or the conscience dimension of the human being, I'd like to briefly trace Frankl's own personal development through which he came to this position, and then to look briefly at some of the fundamental philosophical tenets of his therapy, or what he called existential analysis, or the analysis of existence, which is the, if you like, the philosophical underpinnings of his logotherapy. And finally, to look and see how logotherapy works, and how it can work alongside other therapies in the distinct dimensions of the human psyche, once again, always granting a role to the fact that the human being is a spiritual being, that is to say, a being with a meaning faculty, a conscience. Now, Frankl is a person who was alive to the concept of the human spirit, as mentioned, but he came to this through stages. It is the ultimate stage of his development, which is what we know as logotherapy, and which was set forth in Man's Search for Meaning and a whole host of subsequent writings, is about the nature of this meaning, of this, if you like, the structure, if you like, of human conscience, and the way it imparts, if you like, a moral structure to human personality, and also the ways in which this faculty operates within the psyche in the concepts of responsibility, the concepts of freedom, and so on and so forth. Now, and once again, in order to elaborate this a little bit, I want to go, as mentioned, into some of the stages of Frankl's own personal development. Now, Viktor Frankl was born into an observant, reasonably observant, traditional Jewish family. He himself, however, as he says, in his adolescence, went through a phase of non-belief. And perhaps this early phase, which may have gone also into late adolescence, early adulthood, was also associated with his discipleship, so to speak, of Freud. He knew Freud. He was a fellow Viennese. Freud very much wanted to take Frankl under his wing. He published an early essay of Frankl's in his journal. And so Frankl and Freud was a dominant influence in the early intellectual and scientific life of Viktor Frankl. Now, what that meant, of course, was that Frankl took over what he would later describe as the reductionism of of Freud. Reductionism means that human personality, with its various dimensions, its, if you like, its instinctual base, its perceptual dimension, and its in its, if you like, its higher conscious dimension also, or its if you like, the world view dimension, which is in part of psyche also. Freud reduced all of these ultimately to the instinctual base of the human being. That's the sense of reductionism. We take a human being with a variety of dimensions, even some dimensions which look to be spiritual, which look to be concerned with meaning, and we reduce it, if you like, or it is reduced back to a dominant factor. And in Freud, this dominant factor was the instinctual makeup of the human being. The human being is essentially a driven being, just like an animal is driven by instinct to eat, to protect itself, and so on and so forth. So also the human being, in Freud's view, was driven through certain fundamental instinctual drives. One, of course, the most known is libido, eros, and then there was another drive which is discussed, which is the idea of thanatos, which is a Greek deity which Freud associated with the destructive instinct, or an ego instinct, an instinct which was able to curb and channel libido. At all events, these work in a deterministic manner in the human being, according to Freud. The human being's whole psychic life is reduced to this instinctual base. So Frankl started out as an adherent, essentially, to this view. He also then wandered to another species of reductionism, which was that of Alfred Adler, also a Viennese, prominent Viennese psychologist at the time, psychiatrist, who, however, reduced human behavior to issues of power and a sense of inferiority, etc., within society. More, if you like, what Frankl would call the sociologism, as distinct from the psychologism of Freud, but all bringing human psyche back to an essential determining factor. Now, that was the early Viktor Frankl, first with Freud and then with Adler, two forms of reductions. However, he began to move away from that, and his move away from Adler was facilitated by the fact that Adler, in fact, expelled him from his own circle. And Frankl began to move more towards the concept of a human being as a meaning-oriented being, and that the human beings also show a capacity for meaningful response to their circumstance, which indicates, which indicates also that the human being is not determined. The human being can respond. And there in these years, he developed certain concepts which remained actually into his later work about the human being's ability to transform an experience into a conscious response, which had to do with meaning, whether it was something which was creatively found or experientially developed, or and so forth. So Frankl at this stage is working on he's working in various psychiatric hospitals, and it's also the time of the German Anschluss, the Nazification of Austria, when Hitler comes in and annexes Austria to the German Reich. And Frankl at this time also is working very hard to save human lives And he's acting quite heroically. As a matter of fact, he manages to save a lot of inmates of psychiatric hospitals from the euthanasia policy of the Nazis towards psychiatrically ill people, by changing their location, by changing their diagnosis, and so on and so forth. It is a very difficult and sad time. Finally, Frankl himself is taken to the camps, to the concentration camps. And it's there that he actually finally crystallizes his logotherapeutic teaching. And in that awesome crucible of the concentration camps, he's able to develop the concept that a human being is capable under all circumstances, even the most horrific daily nightmare of the concentration camps, of finding meaning and purpose. And that this sense of meaning and purpose, whereby the human being, so to speak, levitates, or lifts him or herself above the purely, if you like, what he called the psychophysical dimensions of human personality, the emotional and the psychological perceptual dimensions. The person is able to rise, so to speak, up and beyond these lower levels of personality and engage a noetic, which means a meaning-finding faculty, call it the soul, call it the conscience, and through this to find a tremendous resource towards psychological well-being, even under the most drastic circumstances. Once again, this does not mean that is to eliminate the therapies which are peculiar to the neurotic illnesses or the psychotic illnesses, but again, he is seeking the leverage in and amongst these dimensions of the spiritual dimension, the meaning-seeking dimension of the human being. And perhaps here he develops, to the greatest extent, the concept of self-transcendence. Now, self-transcendence is a crucial concept in the work of Viktor Frankl. And it gives it, and it's that which also brings his work deeply into alignment with the religious tradition of humanity. Because the notion is, as I've intimated, that through self-transcendence, the person goes beyond the pressing demands, be it of feeling, emotion, be it of perception, psyche, the somatic development, the psychological development, and the person is able to separate him or herself from their psychophysical predicament. A person is able to rise above it all. That is the essential manifestation of the spirit within the human being. Under much better circumstances than that of the concentration camps, what it says is, I am called upon not to say what I want, what I need, but rather to look and see what it is that life needs of me. Not what do I want, but what is wanted of me. And I may be acutely aware of my wants and needs and my suffering. But even under those circumstances, I am able to ask myself, what is wanted of me? Whether that involves setting aside or modifying my perceived needs and wants, that's a separate issue altogether, but still I can take that perspective. Now, when the human being reaches that level of self-transcendence, then I think I would say the human being has actually bared that faculty, which is called the soul. And there, and for the religious tradition, which I believe Frankl in certain crucial dimensions of his works embraces and sees, as was mentioned last time, the inclusive dimension, that human soul has objective features. It was made in the image of God. which means it has a structure which models the divine attributes, which in turn translate into basic norms of human conduct and human purpose and human morality. Now, Frankl, of course, knowing the strictures of psychological practice, understood full well that the function of a therapist is not to lecture patients, not to tell them what to believe necessarily, but his job. And that's not just because of ethical issues involved in that, but because also it's not therapeutically efficacious. What is therapeutically efficacious is when the patient by him or herself comes to a recognition. The purpose of his logotherapy was to stimulate the process of self-transcendence. And that, and through this, Frankl came up with the extraordinary recognition that even an atheist and even an agnostic who is without any prior education in religion or perhaps any inclination towards it, once that person embarks upon the process of pure self-transcendence, in fact, what is happening is that that person is exposing a faculty which is the soul. The person may not call it that. They may call it conscience. They may call it whatever it is. They may simply say, I'm just talking with myself. I'm communicating with myself. But in reality, what self-transcendence unpacks is a trajectory by which even the atheist or the agnostic comes ultimately to what the consciously religious person has, where the consciously religious person already stands, because what is happening is that this essentially selfless, this faculty of selflessness, which is the soul, which is without the interests of the body and the psyche and so on and so forth, which wants to serve, wants to cleave to its creator, wants to know what's wanted of it. That exists in potential in every single human being. And the process of self-transcendence simply serves to bear it. And obviously will bear it with different degrees of clarity on people depending on where they actually are at the time. At all events, this, I think we can say, this methodology of self-transcendence and logotherapy was fully articulated by Frankl in the camps himself. And he came out from the camp and he wrote that book, which had a different title in German, but which was translated as Man's Search for Meaning, and is quite a legendary work now, even though, as mentioned last time, academic and professional psychology were not yet ready to acknowledge it fully at that time. Now, let's look now at certain of the philosophical concepts in Frankl's work, because psychology is actually a picture of the human being. Psychology is not an ordinary discipline. It is a discipline which actually is the starting point in many ways of the sciences. It says what the human being is. It models the human being, and that model is a crucial model. We have to know what model we are dealing with. It's all important. Now, Frankl says that in his own life experience, as he grew and as he developed through childhood to adolescence to early adulthood, he was himself struck with the problem of existence, which he put it in the following terms. He said, existence seems to have a fragmented character to it. We go through life, and it seems that it's made up of a whole series of discrete moments, and the continuities and the connections are not so clear. This, of course, was a statement which he made at a time when you had in the general secular world a doctrine of existentialism being articulated by philosophers such as Camus, Sartre, and others, Heidegger to some extent. But that secular existentialism sought to emphasize the meaninglessness of existence, the fragmented character of existence, that there's no overriding structure, that existence in itself, in their view, was something which is intrinsically fragmented and disjointed and disconnected, moment from moment to moment. Frankl's view, however, is quite different. Frankl says the human being actually has a continuous purpose and identity over time. And this is because our personal history is in fact a series of actualizations of possibilities of purpose in every moment to moment. And there is an objective and a personal dimension under which this continuity can be perceived. On the cosmic scale, I think Frankl, who was unashamedly acknowledging his religious background, would say that it is God who provides the framework and the continuity of all existence. After all, he is the creator and the sustainer of the world and everything in it, moment by moment. And therefore, history is meaningful before his eyes. There is an overall framework. He even used the expression that, so to speak, God is the coordinate system of history. That doesn't mean he was a pantheist. He's far from a pantheist. But he said that we live under the aegis of eternity. In other words, there is an overall structuring framework for our existence. Time and space are unified before they're created. But this is true also subjectively and personally. Because what is it that actualizes all of our meanings and all of our moments, all of our encounters and all of our predicaments? This is the highest faculty within the human being, which is the soul, the conscience. It's the conscience which is making sense, and actually, if it's working properly, is making the decisions on how to react and how to respond to every circumstance. So our life is, in fact, the history of our actualizations of value. And that is, and how are they linked? They're linked because they are in the history of the personal history of our soul, our consciousness. That's where they form their link. The spirit, the human spirit, is something which is continuous. It's a soul which exists and persists within the human being. And it's something which doesn't even go or vanish upon death. As a matter of fact, whilst we are alive, the most important faculty within us is that spiritual faculty. It's the controlling faculty. It's the faculty which has mind and body at its disposal. But when we cross, if you like, the boundary from life into death, what happens? The soul has to relinquish the baggage. It's no longer or relinquish its vehicles. It's no longer carrying a body and a soul and a body and a mind with it. It travels on just by itself in that sense. So the one thing, so to speak, which unifies and accumulates and integrates the totality of our experience throughout life is that spiritual history. And so that our lives, if you like, are strands of world history. He said we write the logbook of the world. Each of us is writing our own logbook of the world in terms of the decisions we make, the values which we articulated, and all of which are accumulated, all of which are lifted up and unified into our personal histories. So that is what basically existential analysis is. It is to realize that history, our personal history and our personal life in all of its predicaments and circumstances are in fact a series of challenges for us to negotiate a new meaning, a further meaning, a continuity of meaning, however it is. That's what it is. And that's how we have to look at life. We have to look at life in terms of what is this new situation requiring of me? And when we do that, it's not that the history, our lives don't start anew, so to speak, in every moment. It builds on previous moments. But that's what our lives are. It is, if you like, the history of our responses to all of the encounters which we experience in our life, all of the circumstances. So in addition to that, then we come to a further very important concept in Frankl, which is the idea of freedom and responsibility. The human being is essentially free. And what freedom means is freedom to respond. Even a person, and this is very moving, even a person who, God forbid, is in a state of paralysis and cannot move the body, or is in a prison, is constrained is constrained by the most rigorous constraints, still has freedom. What is that freedom? As Frankl says, it's the freedom to take up an attitude towards that situation. How shall I respond? Sometimes I can respond physically. Sometimes I can't respond physically. Mostly we can. Mostly we can move. Mostly we can act. We can do. But even in the situation where action is foreclosed, we have freedom there. Until, God forbid, the human being reaches a vegetative state, as long as the human being's faculties are still intact, the human being possesses the freedom to respond. And that is of greatest importance in the psychological well-being of the human being, to know that our highest faculty, our conscious spiritual dimension, our faculty of conscience, is always free to decide. Nothing drives me. Nothing compels me. It's true, I must eat and I must sleep. Yes, okay, that we know. And there are certain things, there are certain things I cannot become. Of course, there are limits. But within the limits, there is always a range of response, always a scope of freedom to respond. And this is very, very important, particularly in the present. I digress here, because we're living in a time now where, unfortunately, psychology has gone back to a kind of reductionism, where psychology tells us that if the person has an impulse, if the person has a perception, then that person is that impulse. That person is that perception. And at the risk of being polemical, I don't want to turn people off at this point. So much of the gender ideology, when it is taken up by psychology, uses this. It says, you have an impulse. We're not interested in how the impulse came about, but we were interested in actualizing the impulse. You feel this, that's who you are. You have a perception of yourself. A boy has a perception of a girl. Oh, you have a perception. That's who you are. That is a form of reductionism. These impulses and these perceptions come about through all kinds of circumstances, and many of them require a psychological treatment. But one thing which is always free and independent of that is the dimension of conscience, of that higher review within the person. The person says, yes, I do have this impulse. Yes, I do have this perception. But is this impulse a valid impulse? Is this perception a valid perception? How does it match up to what I know to be right and what I know to be wrong? So that here is a crucial dimension which is in fact, unfortunately, been shut out of much contemporary psychology. The notion that there is no counterweight of conscience, that the person is their impulse, the person is their perception. And unfortunately, much contemporary psychology, backed up by legislation, is locking people at various vulnerable stages of their development into that perception and into that impulse-driven direction. But crucial is the notion that there is a second voice in the courtroom, or a third voice. There may be the voice of impulse, there may be the voice of perception, but that third voice, which is the most authoritative voice, is that part of me which is ultimately removed and insulated in potential from the rest of the psyche, which is my conscience. I can transcend that impulse. I can transcend that perception. And from that standpoint of self-transcendence, I may evaluate it and I may see whether it's something I need to struggle with and often with the need, often with the assistance of psychotherapeutic help, psychotherapeutic help as well. Unfortunately, much legislation now is coming in to ban and criminalize the therapy which is accessed by people wanting to live in accordance with their conscience, wanting to carry out a struggle with impulse and perception. That's the extraordinary timeliness of Frankl's work in the present moment. Back to where we are. So Frankl says, the human being always has a margin of response, a crucial zone of ability for freedom to respond and to take up a position to the forces operating within his or her own psyche, or in the external environment, things which impinge from without, not simply which impinge from within. Now there comes a third point, and this third point is also something which is going to be, which is very, very challenging for contemporary psychology, but it is a corollary of the fact that there is something called the soul in the human being, and that this soul is an objective being. It's an objective entity which is exposed through self-transcendence, and that is that there are objective values associated with the soul. This is what needs to be unpacked from Frankl's statement that the ultimate discovery of the human being is the imitation of God. And what that says is that this soul, which has been within the human being from the beginnings of history right through to the present, human history, is that this soul actually resonates with certain eternal values. And Frankl says this in places, and some of his major students, particularly Elizabeth Lucas, says it also explicitly, that the meaning which the person possesses is not any meaning. It's very dangerous to say the human being, so long as the human being has meaning, then that person has accessed their highest faculty. Why? Because unfortunately, there can be meanings which knock out, which knock out the soul from its residency, so to speak, in that highest faculty, and replace it with an ideology which is in fact a pathology. Everybody has got, most people, unless people think very, very hedonistically and impulsively, they do come up with worldviews. They do come up with worldviews which actually justify or explain their actions. But, says Frankl, this will be an extremely challenging thing for psychology to come and meet up with. Frankl says, you know, when we went through the process of self-transcendence, we get beyond ideology. We get beyond what he called these pathologies of what he calls the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. We come up against the fact that there is an objective framework, an objective compass in the human soul. It's just that the human soul should be allowed to express itself, to surface, and to manifest itself within the human being. We are not here to facilitate any meaning. The terrorist has a meaning. The Nazi has a meaning. The communist has a meaning. But these are not necessarily true meanings. This is not the language of the soul. They're ideologies. Okay. So that takes us to a number of, if you like, of the basic philosophical points in Frankl's work. Now, how does this all come out in therapy? Well, Frankl, as mentioned before, didn't claim that logotherapy supplants all psychotherapy. He said its function is supplemental. It is there to work with other therapies. And so when we look at the different dimensions of psyche, when we look at the bodily dimension, the emotive dimension, when we look at, which is sometimes also a physiological dimension of the psyche, or when we look at the perceptual realm, there we have a whole host of therapies which operate in those realms. So, for example, let us take a case of the of that therapy, which is of that psychological illness. Now, mind you, all of these different levels, the somatic, which is the bodily, the perceptual, which is psychological, and the meaning, what he called the noetic dimension, these all tend to interact. Rarely do you have one element in its purity. They all function together. Nevertheless, he said, it's very important to distinguish the levels. On the somatic level, which is the bodily, physical level, we have certain illnesses which are very closely related to this level. For example, which have almost a physiological foundation. Take schizophrenia, for example. Schizophrenia is a situation where the human being loses, unfortunately, their very centeredness, their very sense of self and center. They can hear voices. Their personality becomes split, and so on and so forth. Now, this is something which has a very strong physiological foundation. It could be genetic to some extent, and very often the treatment of it is pharmaceutical. I dare say that sometimes situations of postnatal depression may also be a cure, may also be the product of various hormonal changes in a woman's body, perhaps after giving birth. So therefore, you can very often find a physical basis to certain psychological conditions. So there, the drug-based therapies of psychotherapy come into their own. However, Frankl will say that even in the case of a person who has got such profoundly somatically based illness, such as schizophrenia, there too, we must not forget the space which and the role of the spirit, the human spirit. It's the human the human spirit is that dimension in the human being which is ultimately healthy. And this element of healthfulness of this human spirit can even be brought to play in the person afflicted with schizophrenia. It's a very amusing story which Frankl tells of two sisters, identical twins, who both suffered from schizophrenia and were in the same mental hospital. And one day, the treating psychiatrists mixed them up, and so the psychiatrist of the other one began a resume of the delusional account which had been told by what he thought was his patient, but in fact it was the other sister, because they were identical twins. They got mixed up. Halfway through the session, the poor woman said to the doctor, "Doctor, you've mixed me up with my sister. My story is different altogether. I've got my story. That's not my story. My story is completely different." In other words, they could see themselves. They had an insight into their own madness. Where does that come from? Where does the insight to say that is not me? That somatic reaction, which is whatever is causing it, and the physiology and the chemical makeup of the human being, whatever it might be, which is being appropriately treated with drugs and so on, is not the ultimate person. That's the spirit intervening there. So even in the case of a somatically based illness, one has to admit the human spirit. Wherever you can bring that in, it has a very important role. Then coming to the psychological dimension of the human being, which is not necessarily in the first, so somatically conditioned as the other, though it may relate to that dimension as well. Neurosis. The first was psychotic. Neurosis. Let us come now to neurosis, where a person, let us say, is suffering from claustrophobia, agoraphobia, anxiety, depression, and so on. And it has in many ways a perceptual foundation in the psyche, in the mind. Here too, says Frankl, okay, there are accepted techniques for dealing with all these. There is a psychology of depression, anxiety, and agoraphobia, and claustrophobia, and all of these different conditions which are of a neurotic character. Here, says Frankl, also, good that those experts work there. Or let the doctor bring his expertise, which is peculiar and specific to this level. But at the same time, don't exclude the spiritual dimension, the deciding element. And in other words, since the human being always possesses a space of autonomy, it's that very often which can decide to embark or to perpetuate or to stop, in some, if at all possible, to counter the neurotic element, the neurotic disposition. And Frankl developed all sorts of techniques here, such as those known as paradoxical intention and so on and so forth. But what the main point we're bringing out here is that the spirit can also intervene and on the mental plane. And finally, said Frankl, there is a number even in the noetic realm itself, the meaning sense, the meaning dimension of the human being. There can also be crises there. In fact, many people, he said, in the present age, turn up to their doctors and psychiatrists not with mental illness, but with existential crises, and they want pills for their existential crisis. And the issue there is, and there it is not really a somatically or a neurotically founded illness by any means whatsoever. It might have become that, but it started in a void of personal meaning. And so there, that's an area where logotherapy is on home turf, particularly because that logotherapy is there to stimulate self-transcendence, stimulate response, stimulate meaning, and so on and so forth. So in all of these areas, all of these dimensions, we find that Frankl is saying you must never ever forget that the human being possesses, in addition to a body, in addition to a mind, she possesses a soul. And this, and once you excise this dimension, you have actually not only denied a human being's essential humanity, but you have already, in some sense, impaired the human being's capacity for full mental health. Because this healthy faculty, the soul, which is struggling to surface within the human being, or in many cases is there, is a crucial element. It is, in fact, ultimately the ultimate authority within the human being. In the healthy human being, it is that which has mind and body as its vehicles, as its vessels, as its motors, at its disposal. The boss, so to speak, within the human being should, almost be the autonomous conscience. And where this situation, where the person unfortunately has descended into various kinds of illness, whether it's on any plane, whether it's the somatic, the mental, or even the noetic, the meaning faculty, there the soul, the healthy soul, needs to be called upon, needs to be evoked, needs to be stimulated, needs to emerge so that it comes into a crucial supplemental role together with all the other therapies involved. And as mentioned before, this is something which, through this we recognize the essential humanity of the patient. And unfortunately, it's not just a matter of the patient, individual patients these days. We're living in a society, unfortunately, which is increasingly overcome by collective pathologies in the realm of meaning. And whilst I don't have all the figures, I understand that suicide is at an all-time high. Substance abuse and despair, depression amongst youth is at a high. And all of this comes about, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons, surely one of the greatest reasons, is the exclusion of the spiritual dimension. I just mentioned that an Australian psychiatrist made a survey of a mental hospital. And there he found that 2/3 of the patients wanted a spiritual dimension in their therapy. 10% of the psychiatrists were willing to acknowledge it. So there you see, unfortunately, that the people themselves, the human beings themselves, are crying out for an acknowledgement of the spiritual dimension. And the therapeutic profession has to realize how crucial this is, and they have to, in some sense, find the means for accessing this themselves also. Thank you.